Welcome to the Zweig Letter Podcast, putting architectural, engineering, planning, and environmental consulting advice and guidance in your ear. Zweig Group's team of experts have spent more than 3 decades elevating the industry by helping AEP and environmental consulting firms thrive. And these podcasts deliver invaluable management, industry, client, marketing, and HR advice directly to you, free of charge. The Zweig Letter Podcasts, elevating the design industry one episode at a time.
Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of the Zweig Letter Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn. I'm excited to be with you as always. It's not often that I get somebody on the podcast with my same name. And today's guest, his name is, well, he doesn't call himself Randy. He's Randall Stevens. But actually, a lot of people don't know my actual full name is Leon Randall Wilburn Jr. And my mom is the only one that really calls me Randall. And as we were talking about this a couple of days ago when we got on the phone, but I'm excited to have Randall Stevens on, who is the founder and CEO of getavail.com. And we wanted to bring them on. We're doing a number of episodes on this Zweig Letter podcast about all of these adjacent technologies and businesses that serve this industry in such a profound way. And so Randall's firm is no exception to that. And shout out to Christopher Parsons from Knowledge Architecture for introducing us originally. And so I'm excited that I have Randall on with me today on this Zweig Letter podcast. So Randall, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Randy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So listen, just for our audience, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself? I always like to call it a superhero origin story, but I'd love for you just to kind of give our audience a little background on who Randall Stevens is.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I'm a long-time AEC industry veteran, I guess I would call myself at this point. 30 plus years in the industry. My background was I actually studied architecture in school, but never practiced because when I got out of architecture school in 1991, I started a company called ArcVision that ended up becoming a software company by the late 90s. So I've really spent the last 25 years building software technology products that are being used in the architecture, engineering, construction market.
Yeah. Well, I guess if nothing else, the background in architecture that you had and the fact that you studied it in school has had to inform and help you throughout this process.
Yeah, like it makes me sympathetic to what people are trying to do and why they're trying to do it. So yeah, it's a catch-22, right? I've spent the entire time really focused on trying to build out the technology, but when you didn't live the day-to-day in the practice, it does become a challenge, right? A lot of times you hope to get into building the technology because you experienced the exact pains yourself,
right,
so that you can, kind of understand what it is that you're trying to. But, for myself, that journey was around 3D graphics technology, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And, from that standpoint, I was doing it. I was doing a lot of 3D rendering and animation work around the architecture community. So from that standpoint, as we got into building technology at the other company, ArcVision, it was around trying to solve some of those very specific production problems and things that we were trying to do in the industry. And then as that evolved into, what became Avail, into the content management, information management side, we'd had enough experience through the other company to kind of understand what people in the industry were doing and problems they were that they were facing, and set out to try to solve a broader, what I would consider a broader problem, which is how do you manage all this information that we're creating and trying to consume?
Yeah. And I got to think that, I know nowadays at the time that we're recording this, ChatGPT is almost 2 years old now, right? And artificial intelligence is kind of taking on a whole different form in most verticals, including the design industry. I would have to imagine, though, you probably never thought that the technology would be as far as it's come in the years since when you originally started ArcVision, even before you got to get Avail.
Yeah, it's hard to, it's hard to think too far out. On one sense, you dream about, I can remember sitting in the classroom at the university in the late 80s and dreaming about, robots building walls automatically. And, so from that standpoint, yeah, there's actually those kinds of things have actually come about, but they're, still not prevalent, I would say. So in one sense, you can think kind of pretty far out ahead of you, but when you're developing these technologies, you're usually very focused on 6, 12, 18-month kind of window about what technologies at your fingertips and, that you can implement or try to put in place. So there's kind of a catch-22 between dreaming kind of and then what's actual reality that you could implement in the short term.
Yeah. So essentially where you've come from Arc Vision to now, this whole idea of kind of developing a way to manage all of this information. What was the most unwieldy part of all this information in your minds, do you think, that you solved in terms of a problem?
Yeah, I won't claim that we've completely solved it. The way I look at the industry, I always try to, whenever we're working on a problem, try to back up far enough and characterize the broad problem and try to understand it from as broad a standpoint as possible, and then narrow down to the specifics. And from my vantage point in thinking about this, there's a couple of challenges in this industry. One, it is very, I use the word fragmented. The AEC industry is very fragmented. There are thousands, tens of thousands, millions maybe of players, across the globe and across the industry. So it's not vertically integrated. It's not a big monolithic thing. We call it the AEC industry, but it's really a lot of things. And because it's a lot of things, there's a lot of tools that everybody in the industry uses to get their work done. So the way I always describe what I consider the scale of the problem is, and maybe the source or the root of the problem is, because we're using so many different tools and pieces of software, ultimately an architect, an engineer, people that are sitting behind a computer and at a desk doing their work, knowledge workers, right, that make up the bulk of the people doing this work. They're using software tools to take things that are in their head, get them into some form that's meant to be passed on to the next person, right, to somebody else. I'm going to take an idea or a thought. I'm going to use some piece of software to encode that information and then produce some information that's going to get passed to somebody else. So if you think of it from that standpoint and you look at what's actually going on in the industry, is there are hundreds of applications where people are sitting and producing that information. And largely, this is I use the word another wonky term, you're producing relatively unstructured data, meaning it gets stored in a file. It might be a DWG file in AutoCAD or a Revit model, or it could be an Excel file or a Microsoft Word document, right? It doesn't really matter, PDF document. It doesn't matter. It's just encoded information into some file. But those files, for the most part, are what we set out to, at least initially, try to solve. I call that the loose content problem. It's unstructured data. All this info is just flying around in files. It's being tried to be put on a network for storage, and then people have to know where it is to basically get back or to use that. And if you think about it, the scale at which all that information is being produced every day, it's what people's job is. Most people's job is to produce that information. So the more of that information is being produced, quote unquote, the better. But it's largely unstructured. So when we set out, the first challenge that we set out to try to conquer was that all of these loose files are sitting on the network around projects and around these kind of reusable things that you're trying to get to. And if you're that end user sitting there working, an architect at the office sitting and working on a project, you're needing to get information from lots of different people in lots of different places. And it's a madhouse, really, when you sit back and look at it. So that's what we set out to do, was to put what became Avail was, can we put a layer in between the network and where this file system and where this data is being stored, and how people can more easily get to that and make their life faster, easier, better information flow. So anyway, it's a complicated thing. And like I said, I can't claim that we've solved it all, but that was kind of the context for us thinking about, okay, if we step back from this, what is the problem? And I couldn't have told you that when we first started it. It's easy to tell these stories in hindsight after you have some initial idea about what you're working on, and then over time you kind of develop more of these thoughts about, like, why is it like that, or how do I describe that in such a way that makes sense?
So would it be too simplistic to say that Avail is a better wrapper for the data? You know what I'm saying? In terms of just how that content and all that information that's all in different multiple formats or what have you, that Avail kind of pulls it all together in a cohesive manner.
Yeah, you have to be careful when you start parsing the words that you're using about what you're actually doing. But, another way that I've begun, over time, kind of began to think about this is ultimately you would like all of your information to be in a database. Because if it was in a good structured database and you were connecting to that, you'd have a single, what we would refer to as a single point of truth for getting the information. And if that information changed, everybody's looking at the same information and you don't have anything to worry about. What I began to kind of relate to about that all of the software we use, another way that I would always describe the scale of the problem was, think about every piece of software that you use on your desk. If there's a file save or a file open dialog, now you've got a human deciding where to put that. What do I call it? Where do I save that out? It's not going into one central database. It's actually going into a file. And you can think about files as being lots of little small databases. Your PDF document is it's a file format. It's a small database that's holding information, just like your Revit project file is or your AutoCAD DWG file is. So if you think about that, every one of those files that we're generating is actually just a little tiny database. Those databases are not synchronized to each other. So we set out when we started working on Avail, it was, well, look, all of these files, we're not going to change that overnight, everything's not going into a central database. We're going to continue using pieces of software the way we are on our desktops and producing files for foreseeable future. So we set out to say, let's begin conquering the challenge of, if those files are now sitting on the file system, which is where you store them, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud location, you have to get better structure around that information just to be able to find it, retrieve it. So what we ended up building with Avail was this layer. I always describe it as like we picked the frailties of the file system and what it meant to go get information. Another thing that I like to say is, file systems are perfectly fine, in fact, mandatory for storing information, but we've all had the experience of their terrible interfaces for getting back to information. Everybody's had the pain of rooting around folders trying to find a file, or worse, trying to use the search bar that's in Windows File Explorer to find something. It's just not very good. So we created Avail to be a much better layer in front of all that information for getting back to these files.
Yeah. And all of that makes perfect sense to me. When you started Get Avail, what were some of the pattern or use cases that you found coming up often enough that you were like, you know what, we have to solve this problem? What were you hearing from, firm leaders or maybe IT managers at design firms where you were like, okay, that's a problem I think we could solve?
Yeah, good question. We knew that, when we started building the software back in 2015, by that point, really Revit in the industry had tipped. I always look back at about the 2012-13 time frame that it kind of tipped in the industry. Everybody all of a sudden was using it, and it kind of became the de facto standard. So, and Revit is really one of the, a really good example of a piece of software that does rely on a lot of reusable assets. So that became one of the first use cases. Was there's libraries of all this technical content that people are going to want to reuse from project to project. So that was the kind of, I'd say, tip of the spear, was that we knew that the firms were trying to organize and get back to that info. There was a couple of other products on the market that were helping to do that. What was a little bit different about what we set out, we knew that was probably use case number one, but back to, it's not unusual for a lot of our customers to end up not only dozens of pieces of software, but between 100 and 200 different pieces of software are being used inside of a, relatively mid to large firm to do their workflows. So we set out with Avail to not just be a Revit solution, but we wanted to be as broad a solution across all of those different applications, Rhino, SketchUp, all the technical applications that people were using, Dynamo scripts, Grasshopper scripts. All of that information ends up being stored on the network, and you've got a search and retrieval challenge with all of it. So we kind of, tip of the spear, I'd say, was the Revit. We knew that there was a challenge there that could be tackled. But when we, the way I described, we built Avail knows nothing about Revit or any specific piece of software. We created Avail to be a really good general information content management solution. And then we built little vertical, depending on the specific application or use case, there's like plugins and things that we could write on top of Avail to solve very specific problems, like say around Revit, which we have done.
So it's actually really a very agnostic software.
Agnostic, yeah. my story. I tell all kinds of stories. That's all I do every day is just talk and tell stories.
This is a story podcast, so it's okay.
Yeah, my story is that when we began developing Avail, we made two kind of critical choices that I think, led to the success of the platform in the industry. And that was, we wanted to be content agnostic. I don't care what information you're producing, we should be able to manage it. And we actually, which was a little bit controversial at the time, was we should also be agnostic to where the content is being stored. And by that, I mean, we didn't really care if it was on your network or in a cloud location. That was all the rage, around, 2015, 16, 17 timeframe. Everybody was, trying to go to the cloud. Well, I think we rightly recognized, you're not going to replace one with the other. You're going to add. You're going to have not now, now the complexity is not just the amount of content, the different kind of content, but the complexity in how many different places is all this information trying to be stored and why. So both of those were kind of at the core of what we developed and said, we don't really care where the information is. We should let you store that where that's a different decision process about why you want to store. Sometimes it's a requirement. Sometimes it's a customer requirement about where data needs to be. It could be a corporate requirement about where data needs to be. So we tried to be agnostic to not only the information that you were, but also where that information is and being that interface, that kind of that's tying all that together so that really the end user shouldn't have to worry about where that information is. It's just, can I go to this interface and do I have access to it? And if I do, I don't care if it's in that cloud location or that cloud location or coming off the local network. You shouldn't have to think as you're going on that journey, do I go over there on the network for that or to this drive letter or to that drive letter? Or do I go into the browser and go log into my OneDrive account somehow? It's like all that has become much more complex as well. And like I said, I don't know that we've 100% solved it, but that's been our kind of quest is to try to stay on top of that problem.
Yeah. So obviously 2015, you get Avail, and we're now 9 years in. Are you where you hoped you would be with the company and with the problems and solutions that you're providing to the design industry?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. If you're running a company, you're never where you want to be.
I know.
Right?
I get
it's
that.
Yeah. So when I say we started writing code in 2015, the product actually wasn't available commercially until early 2017. So we've been in the market with the product for about 7 years now. Got a lot of great customers that have adopted it as their solution for this inside their firm for helping to manage this information. Right in the middle of that was this thing that we all had to endure, the pandemic.
Yes, the P word.
We were a company that was on this growth trajectory, and then when the pandemic hit, it's like the good news was it wasn't like we lost business, but it just kind of stunted the growth that was going on. And that lingered for about 18 months and then kind of took off back again. But, I look at our trajectory that we were on and I can never get those 18 months back, right? It's like, okay, how do you get that time back? But by and large, yeah, we've written got a stellar team here working on this, the engineering team, design team. I've got a bunch of people who are trained in architecture and computer science that are on the engineering team. So it's just a bunch of fun for me to attack designing and building, software solutions, but doing it from a real design aesthetic and design process, right? That we kind of learned as being trained as architects to try to follow. So I get a lot of pride and joy out of that and watching the team do the kind of work we do. So are we as far as I wanted to be? Of course not. But it's like a labor of love too. It's like, okay, I'll be 57 in August. And when we set out working on this, I was about 50 years old, late 40s, 50 years old. And I was like, this is probably a juicy enough problem that I could ride the rest of my career out, right? It's a big, big, big problem. So you're probably never done, right? If you're thinking about it properly.
That's true. I hope to keep doing these podcasts for a very long time. Or just podcasting in general. But no, I totally hear what you're saying. And that makes a lot of sense. There seems to always be problems to solve in the design industry, as there are in other verticals. But this is a vertical that I have worked in for more than 2 decades now. And it just always seems like there is something bigger and better that can be done to make the job easier for the design professional, right? Whether it's with their interactions with their clients or potential clients or stakeholders in the community that they serve, whether it's internally helping out their colleagues to do their best job possible. I would have to imagine though that like Avail now it just makes so many people's lives that much easier in terms of when you don't have to lose time to the search, right? Of trying to identify or find information, and you can train up young staff in a way where maybe they don't develop some of the bad habits that we had previously, historically, when it came to assembling and or storing data and the way that we stored it. And so now with tools like Avail, you have options and opportunities to get ahead of that curve and to always have data at your disposal, at your fingertips when you need it.
Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of things, Randy. One is one of the challenges, I think, with this, with a solution like what we're doing is actually having, I think people innately know that it's a problem, like searching, and we've all had the personal experience. I think what definitely is hard to do is to quantify that as a pain point of what that cost is. So, obviously, whenever we're not a revenue, probably most of our customers would not look at what we do as a revenue generating opportunity investment. They're going to look at it as a cost, savings, or can it make us more efficient? And the problem with that is, I call it death by a million cuts. It's like we all know that this is going on, but it's very hard to quantify, right? You're going to quantify it in a minute at a time, 15 minutes at a time, 30 minutes at a time, spread across dozens, hundreds, thousands of people multiple times during the week, right?
Yeah.
So that takes a little bit of a leap of leadership to say, hey, even though I can't, it seemed like the first couple of years when we introduced the product, a lot of times people would be like, how do you measure ROI on this? And I'm like, well, how do you measure ROI today on what you're currently doing? Unless you've got something for me to measure against, it's hard for me. It's like shadow boxing. I can't tell you how much more efficient it's going to make you. You can't tell me how long people are spending today rooting around, and the worst thing is if you can't find something, how often are people going and recreating it? And now you got that time like spent, and is that being counted and accounted for? So anyway, it's a little bit of a nebulous thing to try to measure. So that's always been a challenge for us, is how to quantify that for people.
Well, and that certainly is. I mean, that's the classic design professional is always going to ask you, what's the ROI on this in terms of, is this worth my time and effort or not? And that's a fair question. Can you share maybe some short stories of companies that have been able to utilize the Avail tool and how it has impacted them and what they do? Because I would imagine there have been some companies that have come back to you and said, Randall, this thing's been a game changer for us. It's done this, and that for us, without getting into the particulars.
Sure. There's, I remember probably 5-6 years ago in the earlier stages we had one client that, because we were always trying to, because we were being asked these, can you quantify this? We were always looking for our customers to help us, can you give us any stories about how much this is saving? And, even I can remember there was a client that they called it the project startup process, because a lot of customers, when they would, especially around Revit, when they would start using Avail, they would change their strategy around their templates and the way they were going to start a project. They'd use Avail to try to, maybe by building type, organize information better so they could start a project and, get the thing up and running faster. And, there were stories that were coming in that was like, this used to take us 2 days to get going, and now it takes us a couple of hours, right, to get a project. So those kind of, like you always look for like an order of magnitude. Can I be like 10 times faster around those kinds of things? It's harder on like I said, on the search side to quantify that. What I can tell you is that across our customer base, Avail is being used millions of times a year to search for things and find it. So we have these metrics that we measure. Some of these, we put out these posters every year. If you go to our website, go to our year in review, but we put out like what were the most searched terms. So there's a lot of data and analytics around what we're doing. And the successful firms, you can see that their users are now, that it is the go-to to go search and find that information. And, so we get a lot of gratification, I guess would be the right word, about just seeing that continue to grow and know that people are hopefully putting their hands on their information, much quicker than they used to. But before I lose this thought though, Randy, another thing that I think is really interesting about this industry, one is, you were kind of hitting on it. If you've been working in a firm for years, you've got a lot of knowledge that you've built up over time. including where things are, what projects you've done in the past, and where this information. I hear these stories all the time. It's like, why do you go back to an old project to get information? Well, it's what you know. I was intimately involved with it, so that's the place where I know that information is. I'm going to go back and grab it. But when you look at the industry, I think the stats that I saw, which seem high to me, are like maybe 12% turnover a year inside of a firm. So that's like the average, which seems high, right? If you think one out of every 10 of your employees is going to leave, and or you're going to then hopefully be bringing somebody else in.
It is the single biggest factor that impacts this industry is recruitment and retention.
Turnover. So from that vantage point, now think about every time a person comes in, one, knowledge just walked out the door. That person that used to yell across the desk and say, hey, Randy, where's that blah, blah, blah? And you'd say, oh, it's over here on the network over here. Well, that person just left.
Yeah.
And now you got a new person that doesn't even know the history, doesn't know what the projects were, doesn't know where they're net new to all of this. So I think that, there's this recognition maybe, especially around some of the mid-size and larger firms that, hey, that's a big issue. I've got to onboard those people. I've got to train them. If they're going to be productive, their ramp time to productivity can be shortened by making sure that they've got really good interfaces for getting to all this information. And they don't have to have that historical knowledge in order to still, touch information in this way. So I don't know. Those are interesting things that I think about like, okay, how can we both retain information for the future and then help new people either learn and or find that information moving forward?
So, well, tell me this, because of course this is, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, but now that we're kind of winding down, what has the impact on AI been on your software, right? Because I'm thinking like there's obviously a pattern of searches. These are probably things that you could have done with or without AI just by virtue of keyword searches that are done in your data and the data that you are keeping track of. But I'm curious to know how AI has impacted what you do and if that's informing things to move a lot faster than maybe even you imagined just a few years ago before ChatGPT came on the scene.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. We're running several, I'll say parallel, I'll use the word experiments, but looking at how some of the newer AI and machine learning technologies are going to impact what we're doing. I think if anything, it's not that we didn't imagine a lot of these things. I think it's just accelerating that, hey, we've got to now's the time to begin implementing some of these things. So there's a bunch of machine learning that we can look at and use data. This goes back to my original, expression that even with AI, to get the best results out of any of this, you've got to have good structured information and data. The better, I was just writing, I'm going to be speaking at a conference here at the end of June, and the little topic, I've titled it Garbage In, Garbage Out. It's the age old thing. If you've got bad information in, you're going to get bad information out. AI is not going to change that. In fact, it's going to maybe amplify it, because what people tend to want to do is just think that it's a magic box that you just throw a bunch of information into and it's going to magically spit out some great answer for you. The reality is it's probably going to put even more emphasis on you better understand that you've got to get good structured quality information into it, and then you can get good information out.
Yeah.
We're running a bunch of experiments, right now about how this is going to impact, but for us, it's making it very clear that you've got to have a good underlying content management system. You've got to have good processes and procedures about what that information looks like that you're feeding into any of these new technologies, because if you feed bad information into it, you're going to get hallucinations or bad information out the other side. So there's not going to be any magic to that anytime soon. And I think there's just going to be more emphasis on you've got to get your information structured and then prune it, right? The reality is sometimes, here's another just kind of interesting thought. I think it's in most of our nature to never want to get rid of anything. It's like
guilty.
We hoard digital information as much as we hoard. Everybody's got a garage and closets full of everything. It's probably somewhat in our nature to do that. And the reality is that one, the more digital clutter that you keep, the more you're now having to fight through all that information to get to what you really are needing to get to. because we don't like to throw anything away. And then the nature, I think, now of the AI and machine learning is your information that's newest is probably the most relevant because it's been vetted, QA/QC'd, and is most relevant. The older the information gets, now you got to question whether that's still valid, useful. Should I get that away from the rest of this so that moving forward? So anyway, there's just really interesting, I won't claim that I know the answer. These are the conversations that I'm trying to fight with in my own head and then have with customers like, hey, if we're really going to do these things, we need to get rid of some of this information, amplify the better information, and then we should be good moving forward.
Well, I mean, I hear people say it all the time. Right now, the problems that we're solving and the problems that we're looking at and pondering are good problems to have because the technology is so robust nowadays and the opportunities to solve problems are so strong that it's just a matter of time before we have figured out a lot of the things that we currently struggle with. And certainly controlling and wielding information in a way that makes sense for your organization is probably one at the top of the list of things that I think we're trying to get much more control over. I mean, I do it myself I use a Notion database and I keep information flowing in and out of that. And I want to be able to access that whole database of information because otherwise I don't know whether I'm coming or going, Randall. I mean, sometimes it just feels like that because there's so much information that I have access to. I need to be able to pull up the information that is germane and most important to me at this moment. As I know, a lot of design firm leaders and people that work in design firms need to be able to get that information to solve the problems that they're trying to solve on behalf of their clients.
Yeah, I call that the reality is everybody has what I call a stash. You've got a stash of information that is most germane to that you are intimately familiar with and you can put your hands on. And then everything else becomes this like abyss of information. It's like only if I have to go outside of my stash do I even want to go wading around in that. So now when you look across any sizable firm, it's like, this is why everybody has a stash. Everybody keeps their little stash so they can try to be efficient. That isn't necessarily, what we'd like to see happening. So anyway, there are lots of challenges to try to figure out on this front. Yeah. But we're going to produce more and more information. I guarantee that's not going to slow down.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. And I know you guys will be out there trying to serve the needs of clients on a regular basis. If people that are listening to this want to get connected with you guys, what's the best way for them to do it? How do clients typically interact with you outside of, I love your website. And again, that's GetAvail, GetAvail.com. They have a great blog. They've got some really good articles on here. One is a BIM manager's guide to better content management. And then you even have some customer success stories in here about how seamless content management enhances the employee experience, which I would say a resounding amen to that, because I'm telling you, people get to places. I've heard stories told of people that said, hey, I started working at this company and I thought they had their act together, but the information is just jumbled and it's everywhere and it's unwieldy, I think is the best way to describe it. And you don't want that description of your company by a newly employed person. So
no, I think the website, Randy, is a good place, but also on LinkedIn, we're active on there. You can find the company, but you can also find me on there if you want to ping me and, connect and, engage in conversation that happens all the time. So, and we love talking to, not only our customers, but potential customers and just, it's obviously the connection to the real world and the real customers and the real problems that we're trying to solve. And so we try to spend as much time as we can, deep in understanding what the problems are. And sometimes what we do isn't the right fit. And we're the first ones to admit that and love to hear from some of your audience, what problems they've got around this front. And like I said, I feel like we're still in the infancy of trying to solve it. So, but this, as you brought up, I think we are at the beginning of a new technological, all this new AI and machine learning technology. We're just in its infancy. So over the next few years, we're going to see that come to bear in new ways. So it's going to be exciting, I think, times to see from a technology. If you're developing technology, it's an exciting time. So
yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be. And I'm sure you're bullish about the future, as are we here at Zweig Group. So, but Randall, this has been really helpful. And I'm so glad, again, that Christopher introduced us and gave us that connection. And so we certainly will make sure that everybody has access to this information. We'll put a link on the show notes to the getavail.com website, a link to Randall's LinkedIn profile. And again, just check out the website. You can even download the software, I think, and try it out and see what it's like. Yeah. So they got a taste test, folks. So, I mean, I think you need to check it out and see what you think. But everything is there. Solutions, features, pricing, resources, everything you would ever want to know about GetAvail and how it could ultimately impact the bottom line of the information management within your growing design firm. If you feel stuck right now, probably a good chance that these folks might be able to help you out. So, Randall Stevens, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And again, I think this is the first time that I've had somebody that is my namesake on the podcast. So that's kind of cool.
We need more Randalls.
We do need more Randalls. That's for sure. So, but I appreciate you coming on the Zweig Letter Podcast and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us for a few minutes today. Thank you so much.
Thoroughly enjoyed it, Randy. Anytime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. Another episode of the Zweig Letter Podcast. We hope that this was helpful for you. I definitely want to encourage you to check out Randall and the rest of his team over at getavail.com. They're doing some great things in this industry, in this space. And it really warms my heart to see how this industry continues to transform on a regular basis. If you want to learn more about the Zweig Letter newsletter, which is the oldest running, I make this claim all the time. I think it's the oldest running newsletter in the design industry. We're just going to go with that. But it's been out since 92, and Mark Zweig has continued to write a byline in that newsletter for a very long time. I may even see if I can get Randall to write an article in the Zweig Letter newsletter, but it comes out every Monday via PDF. You can get a copy for yourself. You can get a copy for your whole team at your company, because there's so much great information and knowledge sharing that takes place through that newsletter. And I've been proud to be a part of that newsletter for more than almost 3 decades now. So it has definitely been a real resource for design professionals. So I really want to encourage you to do that along with this companion podcast, is to get the newsletter, subscribe to it. It's free of charge, and you'll thank me later. So I definitely want to encourage you to do that. Remember, you can check out our podcast on every major platform, especially Apple Podcasts. You can rate and review us there. Give us some feedback, what you think about this podcast. And then, of course, if you want to know anything about Zweig Group Advisory Services, just visit zweiggroup.com to learn all about our advisory services in every area that you can think of, from M&A to strategic planning to ownership transition to valuation. We cover it all, and we've been doing all of that for more than 36 years. So that's all I have for you this episode. We will see you back here with another new episode of the Zweig Letter Podcast very soon. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and we'll see you later. Peace.
Thanks for tuning in to the Zweig Letter Podcast. We hope that you can be part of elevating the industry and that you can apply our advice and information to your daily professional life. For a free digital subscription to the Zweig Letter, please visit thezweigletter.com/subscribe to gain more wisdom and inspiration, in addition to information about leadership, finance, HR, and marketing your firm. Subscribe today.